David, tell me something about the national cultural theory.
I think we distinguish between collectivists and individualists, right? And we look at how they differ in their behavior. So, for example, we would say that collectivists, they are more like prone to aggression, and they're less like, they don't fear death as much.
Okay. Yeah.
And in the
and are there some nations or cultures who have been identified as having characteristics that may be more, shall we say, prone to political violence?
Maybe more like generally the Eastern world, as opposed to the Western world.
And on what basis? Why would that be?
I think that because they have a stronger sense of social identity.
Okay.
Compared
do you remember Staub, S-T-A-U-B? He referred to a particular ideology, a particular view that some cultures might have of feeling that they were oppressed, or that people were historically targeting them. He referred to it as an ideology of... Anybody know? An ideology of...
antagonism?
Excellent. Well done, David. Yeah, that's absolutely right. Well done. Okay, moving on. Lara also talked to you about joining terrorist groups. The processes behind someone joining a particular group, and how this was often a gradual process, being socialized by the group into the group and joining the cause, if you like. Can anyone tell me the name of a theory that relates to an individual moving through the sort of gradual identification and joining with a terrorist group? I'm thinking of one theory in particular, with people progressing gradually. Yes, good. Moghadam's staircase. Excellent, well done. Remember, Lara talked to you about the differences between motive, so having a particular need or impulse to act on or commit an act of political violence, but also she referred to the vulnerability of individuals being, if you like, more liable to be recruited into particular types of activity, specifically terrorism. So Lara talked to you about the drivers to engagement with terrorism, and she actually named 3 specific themes. Can anybody tell me what they are? 3 specific themes driving people. Good, David's got it. Injustice, identity, and belonging. And Sue has got it as well. Well done. Yep, very good. So Lara talked you through these 3 themes and suggested that they are predictors, or themes that frequently appear within people who have more openness or vulnerability towards engaging in acts of political violence and terrorism. So, why are psychologists useful in the study and response to terrorism? You could just type your answers, but if you'd like to speak, I can pass you the microphone, and you can tell me. Put your hand up if you'd like the microphone. Otherwise, just type in your answers. Why might psychologists be useful in the study and response to terrorism? David?
Psychologists could have... Hello?
Yep, go for it.
Psychologists, they could have a look at the long-term effects of terrorism.
Excellent. Yep. So there is an impact of terrorism. It's often intended to have psychological consequences, and therefore psychologists are are of use in the study and response.
And also because their views often, or their reality is often very, very distorted. So their interpretations, for example, of the Quran might be wrong.
Okay, so you're saying that because there's a kind of subjective interpretation involved in values and beliefs, and because they often drive people towards political violence, then psychologists would have something interesting to say about that. Yeah, absolutely. And Monique's suggesting that we may be of use in examining ways to prevent this in the future. And related to what David was saying, of course, the actions of terrorists are intended to bring about a psychological effect. So there are a number of psychological aspects. And Katharina Holmes just raising the issue of counterterrorism and being able to use those factors to engage in counterterrorism. And you're absolutely right. Thank you for that, Katrina. Okay, so focusing now on intrapersonal perspectives on terrorism. Just to remind you what, to some extent, what Lara was talking about, and what we focused on for a period of time in my lecture, there's very little evidence of psychopathology or biological factors. But of course, that's not to say that there's not been some discussion or some research related to it. There is, remember we talked about some proposed neurochemical explanations related to the suppression of serotonin. Mandel suggested this idea of religious excitation resulting in the suppression of serotonin. Martens noted that a lot of the characteristics that were in common with terrorists were also a lot of the characteristics identifiable in terrorists were also held by individuals with antisocial personality disorder. If you remember, though, we did spend some time thinking about problems related to that and why terrorists who'd been studied might appear to have characteristics in common with those with ASPD. Can anybody give me an example of what that might be? And for that matter, a problem with a lot of the research on terrorists. Yeah, they have hostile views, of course, yeah. But why is it problematic, a lot of this research? Good, Katrina's got it, a prison sample. Yeah, so much of this research is conducted with individuals, terrorists who've been caught and are in prison. Now, that comes with its own problems, and you're studying a very particular sample of terrorists, aren't you? Good. However, there has been some research on personality characteristics, but Andrew Silk, who we talked about, who remembers is a lecturer here at UEL, has talked about the fact that there are a few identified characteristics. So action orientation, perhaps increased levels of aggressiveness and excitement seeking. But he's concluded that these personality characteristics do not co-occur with enough frequency and in any kind of recognizable pattern that would allow you to suggest that there is some kind of personality terrorist profile. Post, a year after Silk's work on this, did suggest that there were one or two characteristics that did appear to, or tended to appear more frequently in the members of terrorist groups. And what I'm going to ask you to do again is just to click on the particular box that you think are the characteristics that tend to appear more frequently in members of terrorist groups. Which of these pairs? Just move your cursor over the box that you want to choose and then click your cursor. Another couple of seconds for those that have not clicked anything yet. Good. And the splitting and externalization have it. So, yes, Post suggested that if there were characteristics that tended to cluster together and appear with more frequency in members of terrorist groups, it was splitting and externalization. Would you put your hand up if you have a microphone and you can tell me what splitting is? Give me a quick definition of splitting. Okay. Katerina, would you like to tell us what splitting means?
There's a tendency to think in either yes or no category, so either white or black. There's no grey in between.
That's a very nice answer. Yeah. So white or black thinking. Yeah, absolutely. Good. Well done. Now, we talked about how, despite the fact that there was limited evidence for psychopathology, governments and the media still tended to use this idea of pathologization, particularly the media. And we talked about there being one particular possible explanation for finding that terrorists might well have some evident psychopathology. Remember, it wasn't psychopathology causing the terrorism, but we talked about direction of causality being unclear, and in fact the possibility that certain stressors that exist because of terrorist activity, because of frequently trying to evade capture, from plotting secretly, from limiting your external communication and contact with the outside world, that itself might trigger certain aspects of psychopathology, might well be a risk factor. So there was this problem of the direction of causality. Just because you may identify psychopathology in imprisoned terrorist samples, there's nothing to say necessarily that it was the psychopathology that drove them to terrorism, rather than terrorism driving the psychopathology. Is everybody clear about that? If you're clear, perhaps you could give me a thumbs up, please. Nyasha, Delphine, you clear with that? This issue of the direction of causality? Give me a thumbs up if you are. No, okay. Delphine, I'm just going to explain that one more time. So, you may well identify psychopathology within a sample, okay, of imprisoned terrorists, and some people have concluded, therefore, that, or let's say that psychopathology appears frequently within imprisoned terrorists. Some people have concluded that that must mean that terrorists are driven by some kind of psychopathology. We can explain terrorism in terms of psychopathology. But of course, the reason why you might well find psychopathology in that group of terrorists is that the terrorism itself, engaging in that activity, that kind of that sort of secretive, plotting behavior, perhaps dealing with weapons, trying to evade capture, that in itself can cause the psychopathology. So the psychopathology doesn't necessarily cause the terrorism. Engaging in political violence and terrorist activity might cause the psychopathology. Is that clear? Good. Okay. Right, so we also talked about the cognitive approach to terrorism, and that terrorist behavior can be rationalized through particular sets of cognitive process. Could you tell me what are some of those cognitive processes that are used to rationalize terrorist behavior?